Good evening, everyone. My name is Dan Melke. I'm the Dean of the Colleges of Business and Education here at East Florida University. And it's my pleasure to welcome you all here. And we're very pleased to have Dr. Gisela Ernst Slavit here with us tonight. And we had a wonderful session with her earlier today. She'll be enriching your lives here this evening. And she's going to be doing some other things for us tomorrow. So I would like to ask Tanya Lubis, who is our director of our Center for Culturally Responsive Practice, and she's going to do a little bit more of an introduction of Gisela.
Thank you. Welcome, everyone. As Dr. Melke said, my name is Tanya Lubis. I'm a professor in the College of Education and also the director of the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices. And this is our third year celebrating the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices. Dr. Ernst Slavit is a professor of education and English language learning. She teaches courses in sociolinguistics, literacy, and biliteracy, research on second language teaching and learning, ESL methods, and critical issues in the education of Latino students at Washington State University, Vancouver. She investigates language and education in culturally and linguistically diverse settings using ethnographic and sociolinguistic perspectives. She's won multiple awards. She has presented at local, national, and international levels and has a multitude of published works. Most recently, she was the preliminary investigator for a $2.2 million grant, federal grant, to increase the number of K-8 ESL teachers in the state of Washington. She is a native of Peru and has a PhD in bilingual multicultural education from the University of Florida. But most importantly, Dr. Ernst Slavit is a dear friend of mine who has been a mentor to me since the beginning of my career. Before I ever met her in the year 2000, she was helping me as I was a paraprofessional in a local school district in Idaho, working with second language learners, and she and another friend, Dr. Carrie Winger, really helped to mentor me, and that's why I'm here today. So I'm very grateful to have her here to share her wisdom with you all on academic language. And with that, I'll just turn it over to her. Please join me.
Thank you very much, Tanya, for that very kind and generous introduction. And thank you, Dr. Melke and the College of Education and the Center for Culturally Responsive Practices for inviting me. It's great to be here in La Grande. It's great to see familiar and dear faces here. Just for my introduction, so I grew up in Peru with two siblings. My dad was an immigrant from Austria. So at home, we spoke Spanish as our first language, and we learned some German. We spoke with Dad a little German. But our parents believed that the key to success was speaking several languages. So they sent us to English-speaking schools. So the three of us learned different degrees of English, Spanish, and German. My oldest brother was very strong in English and in Spanish, and a little bit in German. My middle brother and I were good in Spanish, good in German, and I went to an American school, so my English was really very good. What I'm trying to say is that here are 3 kids, same parents, and our degrees of language development have been very different as we were growing up. The other thing I want to start by saying is, even though I have all the preparation that I have, my PhD, my master's degree, I've studied in the US, I have published extensively, I still struggle with English. It is not my first language, and academically is my strongest language. And no matter what, if I were to test, do a test in English in my area, next to a native English speaker, chances are I will never be able to get a score as high as my counterpart, whose first language is English. If I were to test in Spanish in my profession, my professional area, next to someone who has done their whole career in a Spanish-speaking country, chances are I will never be able to test as high as that person. So you see what I'm trying to share here is that our bilingual students have so many strengths by speaking 2 or more languages, yet their assessments can never reflect what they know, because our assessments are meant to assess a person in one language and in another language, not in both languages. You see? It's not fair, but that's how it is. And so my whole purpose in life recently is to help people, educators, become aware of the challenges of learning academic language for all our students, whether they are in kindergarten or whether they are in your classes here at Eastern Oregon University. So I'm going to go ahead. That was a long introduction. So this is what I'm trying to do today. Just a couple of guides so you kind of don't. I'm just rambling. I can do that very well coming from Peru. How does academic language look in the classrooms? What do we mean by academic language? How do we make it visible for our students? How do we make it visible for ourselves? And then at the end, questions. Only kind of questions are accepted. So let me start by giving you 3 examples. Eighth grade mathematics. This is an item from that test that is given to several countries. You know that test, and then they compare and they say, oh, the US is 8th compared to Singapore and Germany, and those tests that does. So this was given to our US students and many other students around the world. Native English speakers or students who are very proficient in English. So this has nothing to do with second language learners. So 55% of other countries, students in other countries, got this right. Guess what percentage of you got this correct? Just here is Friday. You can be relaxed. 60, all right. 30, okay. Guesstimate. 40, all right.
20.
We're getting closer. 11%. 11%. This is mathematics, but there are no numbers. It's mathematics, but there are no numbers. Why did our students not get this? It's something to think about, huh? And I'll talk a little bit about that later. Let's go to another example. Social studies, very timely. sample of writing from a student. And this is in Margot Gottlieb's book, the 2016 book on assessment. So I want you to read this and to talk with your neighbor and see, well, what are the concepts that this student, he's an English language learner, what are the concepts that this student understands, and then what is it that this student is struggling with? All right? Are you ready? Drums, okay. Can you talk with a partner just for a minute and a half? Just what concepts are understood by this student, and then where is this student struggling with in terms of language? So these are the two questions. Sorry for interrupting this lively conversation, but you don't want to stay too long here. So let's start by answering the first part. What are concepts that this student is able what concepts does this student know about the topic? And please, when you are prepared to talk, Tanya has to reach you with the mic, because they are recording this session. So who would like to answer?
Can you speak loud?
That's what I said.
The student did a really good job on the main idea and stating what the main idea was and did his best to present it in our grammar. I think all of us got the point of his paragraph or response. It's just that I thought the tenses of what words he said kind of threw it off.
Thank you. Anyone else?
We were talking about the there's an organization, so it's easy to follow. There's reasoning, but there's causal relationships between ideas. And linguistically, there are dependent clauses and aren't any sentence fragments. So, a lot of strengths.
Great, thank you.
May I also speak? And when I look at this example, it reminds me of some of the difficulties I as a parent had with my children and their writing, my two sons, and the kinds of typical spelling errors that I still get in text messages. Where here has the here in it, not there has the here in it.
Thank you. I understand very well those mistakes. Other comments in general, what are areas of, in terms of language development where this student is struggling? Wait. Sorry? Punctuation. Yeah, there's a little bit of that. Any other?
Contractions. Why it's important, we work on contractions.
Okay, some contractions there.
So I was thinking the subject matter was pretty solid, kind of agreeing with Jordan. Just, it's really high level thinking, I think. The lack of commas is definitely sticks out. And basic, grammar and punctuation. What we were talking about, how like that language barrier would naturally lead into a comma error because the natural pauses just wouldn't be there. But overall, I think it's really, brilliant piece of writing. Beginning, middle, and end, clear point, really passionate. So.
Really passionate, right? Yeah. Thank you very much for those comments. So you have said it all. I just compiled some information here. Understanding of voting as a right, consequences for not voting, and then the power of electing a president. Very, very timely. But this was done like 4 years ago, so it just happens that it's a good example to bring. Just how many more days before election? Okay. So in terms of academic language, we have already visited. There are some errors, and that's part of the language development process. But there is a clear understanding of beginning, middle, and end. There are some sentence structures that are well written. So a good example, however, if this would be in an assessment, chances are that wouldn't get too many points. Correct? Let's go to another example, and you don't have to read the whole, but this is science, the concept of torque. Very typical of science text, correct? Very specific terminology, long sentences, embedded clauses. There is abstract. It assumes that you know a lot of stuff, like torque. Formulas, a graphic. So these are 3 examples, very different examples, but this is what students are constantly exposed to throughout their K-12 education. So what are we going to do about it? Let's go ahead and keep working. Oh, you can't see this because academic language is often hidden. It's there for us to see, but the rules that determine when a piece of writing is academic and when it is not sometimes are obscure for our students. For expert language users, we can right away identify this is good at beginning, middle, and end. There's, it's well structured, there's passion, etc. But when you don't have that knowledge, all those rules, like what? They don't seem clear. So our job today is to help bring that kind of clarity, that visibility about academic language. So you see there is an owl, it's hidden in plain sight. Why do we need to focus on academic language? Because it's pervasive in K-12, K-16 settings. K-12, the new Common Core, state standards, the next generation science standards, they all have academic language just front and center. And our students need to learn them. The trick is, we are having a very diverse student population in our schools. By the year 2025, 1/4 of students entering kindergarten will come from homes where a language other than English is spoken. That's not a bad thing. However, it means that some of the academic language might not be there, unless we make it visible for our students in the classroom. And also because we have to work on academic language because of social justice. And let me explain those briefly. So there's a lot of text there. Just ignore that text and listen to me. Because academic language is central in K-12 context right now. It's not only the students need to access, but they need to produce it and show understanding and usage. Like that kid who wrote The Vote. That's how we're gonna assess our students. The first item of the math test. That's the kind of items that our students are getting. So the question is, are we really measuring content or are we measuring language? So every teacher, regardless of the content area, has to teach language. Earlier in the faculty development session, you know, there are professors from different disciplines. And it's like, well, why should I teach language? I teach biology or, you know, or something, accounting. Well, you don't teach language, but you have to make expectations clear for the students in terms of language. How do we make those expectations if we don't have them clear ourselves? So I forgot to mention that. Why is this a matter of social justice? Because in schools, we're changing, in K-12 schools, often we have been assessing kids in terms of academic language or the usage of academic language, and we have not often done a good job in teaching it. There are expectations that we assume students should know, but they don't know them. So we might teach our content area and not the language that they need for that content area. Jay Lemke, a physicist who became a high school teacher and then went back to being a college professor, he published a lot, but one advice is students can't do science if they cannot speak the language of science. So it's not just the words, it's the language. So before we make academic language visible, I want you to spend just, again, 2 minutes with your partner and think about what are the differences between everyday language and academic language. Okay? Just 2 minutes. good conversation, and my apologies for a typo. But what are some differences between everyday and academic language? Oh, Tanya's doing her exercise here.
We thought the difference between the academic language and everyday language is that the academic is so heavy on vocabulary. For everyday language, we just say the same words every day. That kind of makes sense.
Okay. Let's see. Okay. So there's also a lot of vocabulary in everyday language, some of it which I don't understand when my kids are speaking, but anyway.
What we discussed for academic language is kind of who you're addressing. For example, you might be addressing an authority figure or peers that are within your working environment. And the everyday language can also play an effect within academic language as well. But yeah, that's what we had to say.
Okay, thank you. So there's quite a vocabulary that might be more academic when we speak academic language, when we use academic language. And then you just said that it's perhaps a little bit more formal sometimes.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going off of, is that what we notice in academic language is that it's very much formally written, and it's often maybe to an authority figure, but it's really a lot of formality and things like that. But when you use everyday language, there's slang terms, there's a lot less restrictions on how you speak and with grammar usage and everything, as opposed to where academic language, you're looking for those areas of like clear-cut grammar and everything.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else? This is good exercise. I hope you have your Fitbit. Or
Comment about everyday language. I think everyday language also maybe a lot of implied type of from body language and statements because you may be with a group that you are accustomed to. So there's an implied understanding that already actually exists.
Okay.
That you don't have to take into account maybe in an academic setting.
Yep. So there is implied knowledge based on because it's a known group that you're interacting generally. You know, my kids will look at me in one way or another depending on what they want and need, or depending on how I am addressing them as well, or, you know, mom, as opposed to mom. So yeah. So let's keep going. And yes, there are clear differences between academic and everyday language. There are some listed here. Everyday, shorter and incomplete sentences, as opposed to complex sentences and certainly longer. Actions through verbs, and then we tend to make an academic, when we use academic language or language of our disciplines, we use a lot of nouns. Verbs become nouns, and actions become, again, nouns. Active voice as opposed to passive voice. Earlier today I was talking about that, for example, in Spanish, we don't use first person for academic purposes, but we always say we, even though it's only me, my opinion. It's like the royal we. It's we define this way, and it's just a style. I was also sharing that in Spanish, you know, the longer you're writing, the better, and the more flowery the language, the better. Very different than in English, to the point, you know, very boom, boom, boom. And then look at the difference in terms of noun phrases. Improving the nutritional quality of foods offered from other sources. So those are some differences. But how do we make this apparent? How do we manipulate this for students to understand? How do we make it visible for all our students? And as educators, that's tricky, correct? It's very tricky. So, um, so with Margot Gottlieb, we have a book series of 7 books about academic language across the content areas in diverse classrooms. And we talk about academic language like other scholars do in terms of, well, it's the language that appears in textbooks, is the language that appears in tests and assessments, is the language that students need to understand and produce to be successful. And that's the tricky part there. It's the language associated with prestige and power and access, because if students can't pass those tests, they can't go further in their education, correct? It's the language of professional settings. It's what we call in education and in linguistics a register. A register, not in terms of music or a cash register, but a register in terms of that jargon, that way of speaking characteristic of a discipline. You know, there's legalese language, the language of attorneys. Sometimes you go to your physician, you get a report, you leave, and you say, well, I hope I'm good because I didn't understand what my physician told me. No, it's like that. So it's a register. It's known for the people in that social professional group. Just like you were saying in terms of everyday language. You know, it's in academic language, we don't need to explain too many things if we are in our discipline, within our discipline. So what Margot and I have been working on is how do we make academic language visible? How do we kind of deconstruct it? And so we have come with 3 kind of dimensions of academic language. But first, I want to underscore that academic language is not just vocabulary. The new textbooks for our K-12 students come with a big sign that says, Common Core ready, academic language, and then you open the chapters, and what it is, they have the 10 academic words for the chapter. Hey, it used to be that in terms of teaching a foreign language, some people decided, this was like 50 years ago, that if you teach 800 words in a language, you will be able to dominate the language. So how many of you in your foreign language classes learn a couple of vocabulary words, a couple of conjugations, and then you went to the train station and couldn't buy a train ticket? You sometimes memorize how to order food in a restaurant. And you memorize it, then you are in Paris and like have no idea and then pointing to your food or looking at the neighbor and saying, that's what I want. Because that doesn't work. Learning words, it's how you put those words together. So when we talk about academic language and the dimensions of academic language, we have these 3 constructs. At the discourse level, at the sentence level, and at the word phrase level. Vocabulary phrases, we know what those are, correct? The 10 top words for the lesson. But the other 2 categories are a little bit trickier. So let me explain a little bit. At the discourse level, what we mean is specific chunks of language that we put together that have a specific set of rules. If you're doing any type of assignment, let's see, any teachers here that would like to say something that they just asked their students to do recently? An assignment, a task? Ratios, okay. So what was the big chunk of language that they had to do with ratios?
Ratios.
Rates,
Vision,
okay.
corresponding.
Do you ask them to do maybe story problems?
It came, that's
Yeah.
where it started.
So the story problem would be, a chunk of language, like the first item, that is very typical in mathematics, in that they need to be able to deconstruct and understand in order to solve a problem. So earlier today, there were two professors from different disciplines, and so one of them I mentioned, well, in your class in the lab, it was anatomy, students have to write a lab report, correct? Then they go to their English class, this was the two professors, and they have to write a book report. They're both reports, but they have very different rules. And the expectations are different. And when we make those expectations visible, then our students can be successful. We assume sometimes, particularly at the high school level, that a student comes and says, oh, they know how to do a lab report. Well, not always, especially if students have not been schooled in the US. A book report or a critique. Listen, where I come from, we don't criticize the authors who are published. We don't criticize our teachers. So the expectations to write a critique or evaluate this or evaluate that are novelty. They bring a lot of newness to our students, to many of our students. Let me just tell you a brief, well, I'll skip it because in the essence of time. So by discourse, we talked about chunks of language, how those are organized. Genres. You know, genres is something that we use in English language arts, but think about it in those terms for other disciplines. Because in social studies, students have to do many different types of chunks of language. At the sentence level, what is it that we mean is how to put those words together in sentences, how to know those grammatical rules. Sequencing, first, second, third, next, finally. Compare and contrast, cause and effect, those have kind of rules that are kind of automatic, correct? If you look in the academic language book, we have charts that show what is it that you can put in your classroom so students realize, oh, compare and contrast, this is how it's built when they don't know how to do it. Are you still with me? Yeah. See? Yeah? Jawohl? So here I have color-coded for your easiness some examples of how in the different content areas you can see chunks of language discourse at the sentence level and at the word and phrases level. Of course, many of those overlap, correct? Like cause and effect we do in almost every discipline, compare and contrast, etc. Okay. So, how many math teachers are here? 1, 2. Okay. So, I'm going to use mathematics as an example to look at these 3 dimensions. How do they look in mathematics? Now, I'm not a math major. I like mathematics. I married a mathematician, so I have his approval to share this. But if you have any questions about mathematics, I'll give you his email. So let me just walk you through these different levels of academic language, these 3 dimensions by showing you examples from mathematics. Find X. The student wrote, here it is. This is he found it. This is an example from Judith Moshkevich. And it's a great example to show that in mathematics, everyday words have very unique meanings. Think about words like table, product, column, pi. Those all have very unique meanings in mathematics. Fine. The student found it, but it was not the right one. Like in any content area, we can organize the vocabulary of the mathematics field in many different ways. You know, here is one way of organizing it. You can have tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. The point is that there's quite a bit of words and phrases that are very, very typical and needed in mathematics. In mathematics, unlike other content areas, they have letter conventions, and I'm not going to go into detail, but sometimes knowing that you're going to use capital letters A, B, C, etc. in geometrical figures would be helpful. You don't use a lot of X, Y, and Z in geometrical figures, correct? So those are little things, but conventions, letter conventions, and this is here, in symbols, this is where there's the belief that mathematics is a universal language because of this part. But the way we teach mathematics in schools is not just based on symbols. Grammatical features, you say, this is mathematics class, and we don't teach grammar. Well, but little tiny words, prepositions, have big meanings in mathematics. Let me show you. This is a question, do you say divided by or divided into? Look at this example here. The temperature fell by 12 degrees. The temperature fell from 12 degrees. The temperature fell to 12 degrees. Those little words there change the whole meaning of each of those sentences. And if you don't get it right, if you don't, you miss the whole problem. Listen, I've been in this country more years than I want to share with you. But prepositions are hard to learn. They're so arbitrary. I use several examples. One of them is, why does a chair burn up and a house burns down? I want a rule here. Someone explain to me. Prepositions are difficult, very difficult to learn, and we teach them to our kids since preschool. Under the table, over the table, behind the table. Don't we teach that since kindergarten? So for our ELLs coming in 4th grade, they already miss a lot of that understanding. Discourse. Earlier we talked about story problems as an example, very typical and pervasive in mathematics. Story problems since kindergarten now. They are using story problems. This is an example I like to share because this is our oldest son was doing his math homework. So this is an old edition of that series. And so he calls me and says, Mom, can you help me with this one? So I looked at it, I read it, and I said, oh, I think we can get your dad, because I was like not too sure. So we brought Dave, math education professor. So it's the three of us reading, my son, my husband, and moi. And so we started saying, will the friend start on pane 1 of window 1 or on pane 3 of window 1? Will she or he then move to window 2 or continue in window 1? Is the comparison about the two friends or between the one friend and the two of you? What is a pane anyway? So here, we just couldn't decide very well what to do with this story problem. And like this, it's not that it's bad, but that's how story problems are. And it's about language most of the time, not about content, not about mathematics. In fact, we often see kids, when I visit classrooms and for observations, so they're doing multiplication. Well, the kids see numbers there, they multiply. So they're doing addition, the kids see numbers, they add. They're doing et cetera, et cetera. And so we have to help students and provide strategies as to how to tackle story problems, because there's a lot of language there, even though it's measuring mathematics. So I have a little task for you. Let's see, do I have time? Until 7? Okay, I don't have time. I was going to give you a little task here. And the goal was to see what are some areas that might trip students. All students, by the way, because academic language is not just important for our ELLs, our English language learners, for everyone. Regina earlier was sharing about her 2 sons. I have 2 sons. You should hear how they talk sometimes. It's like, your parents are professors? Because they use everyday language, they text, they write differently than what the expectations are in school. So anyway, I'm not gonna, but this was gonna be your task, and I'm gonna just skip this whole thing, my analysis of it. Just, if you're curious, these are all the different aspects of this program, of this problem that might trip students. Idiomatic expressions, ellipsis, we use that a lot in science and math. So 4 workers, 6 hours. Shouldn't there be some little words in between some of those words to connect them? Takes, everyday word, but it has 100 different meanings. So what is the meaning for this one? Et cetera, et cetera. So story problems are quite pervasive and quite complicated for all our students. So going back to the 3 dimensions, I mentioned this earlier. If we just teach vocabulary and say academic vocabulary, we're providing students a bunch of bricks. Bricks are expensive, they're useful, they're heavy. But with bricks alone, you cannot do too much. So you need to help them learn the structures. And Dutra and Moran and Jeff Swires talk about brick and mortar, and to putting those words together to make a wall. But walls alone would not protect. I'm not talking about that wall. I'm talking about this wall. Walls alone would not protect you. You have to be able to put walls together to create a structure. And that's the discourse. That's the chunk of language the students need to create for different content areas. For our K-12 students, it's not just about learning the language, correct? The language is one way of accessing content. It's one way of showing understanding of that context. But those buildings, if they don't have a solid foundation, they are not going to be very strong, correct? They might just fall down unless they're connected with students' backgrounds, strengths, and needs. Because if someone focuses only on the mistakes I'm making when I speak English or the typo I had on my slide, it's not very good. But if you focus on some of the things I have to say and have studied, then I feel very good. I am successful. And finally, academic language is not just one other thing that students need to learn. It's the vehicle to access critical thinking. It's a vehicle to access the knowledge, the content knowledge that they need to understand, to be lifelong learners, to come to college, etc. So I'm going to skip this because I want to get to suggestion for practice very fast, okay? Because I've talked, but then what are you going to take with you? 1, make language visible. How? By focusing on the 3 dimensions, or other researchers have different ways of kind of deconstructing academic language. Think also about academic language not only in tests or the tasks you give, or the textbooks or readings that they have to read, but in the talk. We have to model academic language. We have to model it in classrooms because students are not going to hear it in the playground. They are not going to hear it in the neighborhood. They might hear it during dinner time like my kids, but they might not even pay attention to it. Make language visible by helping them understand the relationships between words. For our Spanish-speaking students, There are so many cognates. And look, when you find the root of one word, you might have an understanding of a whole family of words that belong to that same root word. Make visible language by having charts about the different terms used for addition. Correct? We use a lot of terms. We teach them one way, and then the assessment is in a different way. Use different registers in the classroom. Not only academic, but not only everyday, because then the students can then listen both and make connections. If you speak all the time here, they get bored, correct? Allow translanguaging. Anyone knows what translanguaging is? Yeah? Let me show you. I want to read this little excerpt. Meet Beatriz. Beatriz is a first grader. Like many of your students, she came to the US when she was 3, attends an ELL program. She comes from a home where Spanish is spoken. So when we think about Beatriz, we generally think about, okay, at school she speaks English, at home she speaks Spanish. But it's a little bit more complicated. Let me show you why. I'm trying to read a little text that has disappeared. At home, Beatriz recounts her day in Spanish to her mother and translates several documents sent by the teacher. Draws outside with friends using English and Spanish. Before dinner, completes her homework writing in English and discussing schoolwork with siblings. When the landlord comes, Beatriz translates, etc., etc. That's at home. During school, she was assigned that day to being the broker for a new student who came and didn't speak English. At recess, she talked with several of the kids, both in English and Spanish. In the bus, she was singing songs in English with this group, and then went and talked to some other kids in Spanish. So when we talk about our bilingual kids and we separate English and Spanish as they are not connected, we are really missing all what Beatriz is doing, which is using English and Spanish in so many different contexts. And what the idea of translanguaging is that we should allow students to use the different linguistic resources they have, even though they are mixing them. Because, like I said earlier, I can never test or be as strong as a native English speaker or as strong as a Spanish English speaker. So Ofelia Garcia's metaphor, and I will end with this, is when we think about monolingual, we're thinking about, a unicycle, bilingual, a bicycle. But when we allow students to translanguage, an all-terrain vehicle, because they can use all their linguistic resources to get wherever they need to get. And I'm going to end that because it's Friday, and I thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon, evening here. You are remarkable. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you all for coming, and those watching online. I saw that there's about 15 people with us online right now. So there they are. In front of you, you have a evaluation and feedback for us. It's really a KWL. What did you know before you came? What did you learn? And what would you like to learn next? As you're thinking about what you would like to learn next, our next event here will be not until April, but April 28th, we'll have Drs. Francisco Rios and Kristen French coming from Western Washington University. Please take some time, give us your feedback. Oregon Teacher Pathway mentors, please come down to the front because I'd like to get a photo with you and Dr. Slavit. And then please enjoy some refreshments and have a great evening, and thanks for coming.
Thank you.